The metal of the IV pole rang like a bell when it connected with Dr. Mitchell's skull. Blood splattered across the pristine white tiles of Seattle Memorial's emergency room as the 6'2", 220-pound former Marine sergeant collapsed, his service weapon clattering across the floor. 23 hostages cowered behind overturned gurneys, watching in terror as the armed man turned his hollow, rage-filled eyes toward the small figure standing in the corner. But Emma Kane, the quiet night nurse everyone dismissed as too soft for emergency medicine, didn't run. Instead, she looked directly at the gunman and spoke 2 words that made his weapon hand freeze mid-air. Semper Fi. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of hidden heroes. Emma Kane was invisible by design. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, she moved through Seattle Memorial's trauma ward like a whisper, always keeping her head down, always apologizing for taking up space. The other nurses called her Mouse behind her back, and the nickname wasn't meant kindly. After 18 months on the night shift, Emma had perfected the art of being forgettable. Shoulders hunched, voice barely above a murmur, hands that trembled just enough to make the attending physicians shake their heads in disgust. "Kane, you're dropping IV bags again," Dr. Richard Hawthorne snapped, his voice cutting through the 2 a.m. silence of the emergency department. Hawthorne was the kind of surgeon who wore his authority like a weapon, all silver hair and expensive cologne, the sort of man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. He gestured dismissively at the saline bags Emma had been restocking. "How many times do I need to tell you? Precision matters in medicine. If you can't handle something as simple as inventory management, maybe you should consider a career in retail." Emma's cheeks flushed red, but she kept her eyes fixed on the supply cart. "Sorry, doctor. I'll be more careful." Her voice carried the faint rasp of someone who'd spent too many years breathing in smoke and dust, though none of her colleagues knew why. "Sorry doesn't save lives," Hawthorne continued, warming to his favorite theme. He turned to the cluster of residents who followed him like eager puppies. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Nursing school is pumping out these timid little flowers who think good intentions are enough. In my day, nurses were professionals. They could handle pressure." He looked back at Emma with naked contempt. "Some people just aren't built for this work." The residents nodded along, though a few looked uncomfortable. Emma had worked alongside most of them for over a year, but she'd never once raised her voice, never pushed back against the endless stream of criticism and casual cruelty. To them, she was exactly what Hawthorne said, a weak link in the chain, someone who'd probably wash out within another year. What none of them knew was that Emma Kane had once been Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane, United States Navy, attached to the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment. She'd earned her corpsman wings in the blood-soaked sands of Helmand Province, where she'd performed emergency surgery in the back of armored vehicles while under heavy machine gun fire. The tremor in her hands wasn't from nerves. It was from the IED blast that had ended her military career, leaving her with hearing damage, chronic pain, and a purple heart she'd never told anyone about. Emma finished restocking the supply cart and retreated to the break room, where she sat alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Through the small window, she could see the Seattle skyline glittering in the distance, peaceful and oblivious to the small wars being fought in hospital corridors every night. She closed her eyes and let herself remember, just for a moment, what it felt like to be someone people relied on instead of someone they wished would disappear. The radio crackled to life, disrupting her brief moment of peace. "Seattle Memorial, this is Medic 47. We're inbound with a Priority 1 trauma, ETA 4 minutes. Male, approximately 35. Multiple lacerations and possible head injury. Patient is combative and refuses treatment. We've got him restrained, but barely." Emma stood up, her movements automatic and efficient. Priority trauma meant all hands on deck, even the weak link. She made her way back to the trauma bay, where Dr. Hawthorne was already barking orders at the residents. "I want Trauma Bay 1 prepped now. Get me 2 units of O-negative standing by, and someone find out if we have a psych consult available. If this is another drunk looking for attention, I want him sedated and out of here in an hour." The ambulance bay doors burst open, and the paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney. The man strapped to it was exactly as described, mid-30s, covered in what looked like defensive wounds on his arms and hands. His clothes were torn and bloody, but Emma's trained eye immediately picked up details the others missed. Military-issue combat boots, faded but well-maintained. A tattoo on his visible forearm that she recognized, the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. And most telling of all, the way his eyes moved constantly, scanning the room for exits and threats. "What's his name?" Dr. Hawthorne demanded as the paramedics transferred the patient to the hospital bed. "Says his name is Marcus Torres. Found him outside a VA clinic downtown. Apparently got into some kind of altercation. Witnesses said he was talking to people who weren't there, throwing punches at shadows. Classic PTSD episode, but he's been non-compliant with treatment." Emma moved closer, ostensibly to help with the transfer, but really to get a better look at the patient. Marcus Torres was lean and wiry, with the kind of fitness that came from years of military discipline. His eyes, when they weren't darting around the room, held the 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in too many Marines coming back from deployment. This wasn't just another psychiatric case. This was a warrior who'd been broken by a war most people preferred to forget. "Torres," Dr. Hawthorne said loudly, as if volume alone could penetrate the man's obvious distress. "Can you hear me? You're in a hospital. We're going to help you, but I need you to calm down." Marcus's response was to strain against the restraints, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Where am I? Where are my men? We need to get back to base. The convoy—" His words tumbled over each other, lost in the maze of memory and present reality. "Sedate him," Hawthorne ordered. "I'm not dealing with a psych case all night. Kane, prepare 10 milligrams of Haldol." Emma hesitated. She'd seen enough combat trauma to know that chemical restraint was often the worst possible approach for someone in Marcus's condition. It could trigger an even more violent episode, especially if he perceived the medical staff as a threat. "Doctor, maybe we should try talking to him first. He might respond better to—" "I didn't ask for your opinion, Kane," Hawthorne snapped. "I asked you to prepare the medication. Can you manage that, or do I need to find a nurse who can follow simple instructions?" Emma bit back her response and moved toward the medication cart. But before she could draw up the syringe, Marcus Torres made the decision for all of them. With a roar that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his damaged psyche, he snapped the leather restraints like they were made of paper, the kind of adrenaline-fueled strength that kept Marines fighting long after their bodies should have given up. In one fluid motion, he rolled off the bed and landed in a combat crouch, his eyes wild but his movements precise. The years of training were still there, buried under the trauma, but accessible when his brain interpreted the medical environment as a combat zone. "Contact front!" he screamed, the words echoing off the hospital walls. "IED! Everybody down!" Dr. Hawthorne stumbled backward, his face pale with sudden fear. The residents scattered like startled birds, abandoning their posts and diving behind whatever cover they could find. One of the younger nurses, Sarah, let out a scream that only seemed to agitate Marcus further. That's when Marcus spotted something that changed everything. The security guard's gun. Officer Peterson was in his 60s, a retired cop who'd taken the hospital security job for easy money and decent benefits. He'd never had to draw his weapon in 5 years on the job, and when he fumbled for it now, His arthritic hands betrayed him. Marcus moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in 2 strides and disarming Peterson with embarrassing ease. Now Marcus Torres stood in the middle of Seattle Memorial's trauma bay, holding a loaded .38 revolver, his eyes seeing enemies that existed only in his fractured memory. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice deadly calm now that he was armed. "I've got rounds down range, and I will engage any hostile targets." The military terminology flowed naturally, even as his grip on reality slipped further away. Dr. Hawthorne raised his hands, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked terror. "Please, we're doctors. We're here to help you." "Help?" Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You people don't help. You just drug us up and ship us home so nobody has to look at what the war did to us. Well, I'm done being invisible." Emma had retreated to the back of the trauma bay during the initial chaos, but she wasn't hiding like the others. She was observing, calculating, remembering her training. Marcus wasn't a random psychiatric patient having an episode. He was a Marine in combat mode, operating under the delusion that he was still in Afghanistan. That meant he was following rules of engagement, military protocols that Emma understood better than anyone else in that room. "Torres," she said quietly, using the calm, steady tone she'd learned in combat zones. "What's your unit?" Marcus's head snapped toward her voice, the gun tracking with his gaze. But something in her tone, the way she'd asked the question, made him pause. "2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines," he replied automatically, the muscle memory of countless roll calls taking over. "Why?" Emma stepped forward slowly, her hands visible and empty. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, wondering if she'd finally snapped under the pressure. Dr. Hawthorne was gesturing frantically for her to get back, but she ignored him. "What year did you deploy to Helmand?" she asked, still moving with deliberate slowness. Marcus blinked, confusion flickering across his features. 2019. But that's classified information. Who wants to know?" "Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane," Emma replied, and for the first time in 18 months, she stood at full attention. Her shoulders squared, her spine straight, her voice carrying the authority she'd buried under years of deliberate invisibility. "I was attached to 3-7 during Operation Iron Fist. I remember you, Torres. You carried Martinez to the LZ when he stepped on that IED outside Sangin." The effect on Marcus was immediate and profound. The gun wavered in his grip, and his eyes focused on Emma's face with sudden recognition. "Doc? Is that really you? But what are you doing here?" "I'm a nurse now," Emma said simply. "Been out for 3 years. But once a corpsman, always a corpsman, right?" Marcus lowered the gun slightly, though he didn't put it down entirely. I can't tell what's real anymore, Doc. Sometimes I'm back there, and sometimes I'm here, and I don't know which is worse." Emma continued her slow approach, close enough now that she could see the tears in Marcus's eyes. Around them, the trauma bay had gone completely silent, except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant sound of sirens, backup that wouldn't dare enter until the situation was resolved. "I know," Emma said, her voice gentle but firm. "The dreams, the flashbacks, the feeling like you're losing your mind a little more every day. I've been there, Marcus. We all have." "They don't understand," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "These people, they look at us like we're broken toys, like we're something to be fixed or thrown away. They don't know what we've seen, what we've done." Emma was close enough now to reach out and touch the gun barrel if she wanted to, but she kept her hands at her side. "They don't understand because they weren't there. But I was. I remember that night in Sangin when the Taliban hit us with rockets for 6 hours straight. You and Martinez held the perimeter while I worked on Williams. You saved that kid's life. Marcus's grip on the gun loosened further. Williams. Yeah, the new guy from Texas. Kid was always talking about his girlfriend back home. Did he make it? I never found out what happened to him after medevac. He made it, Emma lied smoothly. Williams had died during transport, but Marcus didn't need to carry that weight. Married his girlfriend when he got home. They named their son Marcus. That broke something inside Torres. The gun clattered to the floor as he collapsed to his knees, sobbing with the kind of raw anguish that came from years of suppressed trauma. Emma was there instantly, kneeling beside him, one hand on his shoulder as he fell apart. I killed people, Doc, he whispered. I was good at it. And when I came home, nobody wanted to talk about that. They wanted to say, thank you for your service, and pretend the war never happened. But it's always happening. Every night when I close my eyes. Emma glanced around the trauma bay, where her colleagues were slowly emerging from their hiding places. Dr. Hawthorne looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face ashen and his hands shaking almost as badly as Emma's used to. For the first time since she'd started working at Seattle Memorial, she was the most composed person in the room. Torres, look at me, she said firmly. You're safe. You're home. The war is over. Is it? Marcus looked up at her with desperate eyes. Because it doesn't feel over. It feels like it's just getting started. Before Emma could respond, the sound she'd been dreading filled the air. The deep, rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Marcus tensed, his training kicking in despite his emotional state. Incoming air support, he muttered, wiping his eyes and looking around for the dropped weapon. Emma knew that sound too. But these weren't medical helicopters with their distinctive high-pitched whine. This was something heavier, more purposeful. Military transport birds flying in formation. Her heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. The building shook as multiple aircraft landed simultaneously on the hospital's roof and in the parking lot. Within seconds, the trauma bay doors exploded inward, and tactical operators in full combat gear flooded the room. They moved with the kind of precision and speed that came from years of counterterrorism training. Weapons raised, laser sights painting red dots across the walls. Everyone on the ground, now, the lead operator shouted. Hands visible, no sudden movements. The hospital staff complied immediately, dropping to their knees with their hands behind their heads. But Emma remained standing, her hand still on Marcus's shoulder, and Marcus stayed exactly where he was. Stand down, Torres, the team leader called out. He was a tall man with lieutenant colonel's insignia on his tactical vest, his face hidden behind ballistic goggles and a communications headset. This ends now. Marcus looked up at him with dead eyes. I didn't hurt anybody, sir. Doc talked me down. Doc? The team leader's attention shifted to Emma for the first time, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. You're not the attending physician. No, sir, Emma replied, falling back into military protocol without conscious thought. Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane, former Navy medical, attached to 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. The team leader went very still. He raised one hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons slightly, then reached up to pull off his tactical helmet and goggles. The man underneath was perhaps 45, with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that came from too many years in too many war zones. Kane? Emma Kane? His voice carried a note of disbelief. Emma's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice, even after all these years.
Colonel Morrison?
It's General Morrison now, he replied, stepping closer. And you're supposed to be dead. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years building a new identity, burying hospital corpsman Kane under layers of deliberate mediocrity and civilian anonymity. The last thing she'd ever expected was for her old life to come crashing into her new one in the middle of a hostage situation. The records were classified, she said carefully, acutely aware that every word was being recorded by multiple agencies. My discharge was medical, sir. Honorable. Medical discharge my ass, Morrison said, though there was something that might have been admiration in his voice. You disappeared after Operation Red Dawn went sideways. 3 dead Marines, 2 missing, and 1 corpsman who supposedly died in the explosion that took out the convoy. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Operation Red Dawn was buried so deep in classified files that even most military personnel didn't know it had happened. It was a black ops mission in Syria that had gone catastrophically wrong, the kind of mistake that got covered up to protect political careers and maintain plausible deniability. I don't know what you're talking about, sir, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. Siren Four, he whispered. Emma's knees nearly gave out. Siren Four had been her call sign during the operation, known only to the highest levels of command. If Morrison knew that designation, it meant he also knew what she'd done in the Syrian desert, and why the Navy had been so eager to fake her death and give her a new identity. There were complications, she said quietly. The mission parameters changed. The mission parameters changed because you saved 18 Marines and 2 journalists from a situation that should have been a massacre, Morrison replied. And then you vanished rather than face a medal ceremony that would have blown operational security wide open. Around them, the other hospital staff was beginning to realize that this wasn't a standard law enforcement response to a hostage situation. The tactical team wasn't treating Emma like a witness or a victim. They were treating her like a fellow soldier. Dr. Hawthorne, still kneeling on the floor with his hands behind his head, looked completely bewildered. What is this? He demanded. Who is this woman? Morrison ignored him entirely, his attention focused solely on Emma. We've been looking for you for 3 years, Kane. Did you really think you could just disappear into civilian life and nobody would notice? I thought that was the point, Emma replied. New identity, clean records, no connection to the old life. That was the deal. The deal was temporary, Morrison said. We let you disappear until the political situation cooled down, but things have changed. We need Siren Four back. Emma looked down at Marcus Torres, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion. Here was a fellow Marine, broken by the same system that had nearly destroyed her, reduced to taking hostages in a hospital because nobody would listen to his pain. And here was her old commanding officer, representing the same military machine that had chewed them both up and spit them out. I'm done with that life, sir, she said firmly. I'm a nurse now. I help people heal instead of helping them kill. You helped people heal in Syria, too, Morrison pointed out. 18 Marines went home to their families because of what you did. That journalist won a Pulitzer for the story she was able to write because you got her out alive. You didn't stop being a healer, Kane. You just changed uniforms. Emma was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. What do you want from me? There's a situation developing in the Pacific, a joint operation with multiple branches. The kind of thing where having a corpsman with your particular skill set could save a lot of lives. I can't give you details here, but— No, Emma interrupted. I mean, what do you want from me right now? With him? She indicated Marcus, who was still kneeling on the floor, looking lost and confused. Morrison glanced at Torres, and for the first time, Emma saw something like compassion in his expression. "Marines take care of Marines," he said simply. "Torres is coming with us. He'll get the kind of treatment he needs, the kind that civilians don't understand how to provide." "And if I refuse to cooperate?" Emma asked. Morrison's smile was thin, but not unkind. "Then you continue being Nurse Kane, and we continue pretending Hospital Corpsman Kane never existed. But Torres still comes with us, because he's a danger to himself and others in this environment." Emma looked around the trauma bay, taking in the faces of her colleagues. Dr. Hawthorne, who had spent months undermining her confidence and treating her like a liability. The residents who had watched her be humiliated without ever speaking up. The nurses who called her Mouse and made jokes about her trembling hands. Then she looked at Marcus Torres, a broken warrior who had trusted her enough to put down his weapon and let himself be vulnerable in front of people who couldn't possibly understand what he'd been through. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what happens to him?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "He gets the help he needs. Real help, from people who've been where he's been. We have facilities, programs, things that work better than just throwing medication at the problem and hoping it goes away." Emma nodded slowly. She looked down at Marcus one more time, then back at Morrison. "I'll need to give my supervisor notice." "Already taken care of," Morrison replied. "As of this moment, you're on indefinite leave for a family emergency." Dr. Hawthorne finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous. You can't just walk into a hospital and kidnap our staff. Emma, what is this? Who are these people?" Emma turned to face him, and for the first time in 18 months, she didn't apologize or lower her eyes. "These people, Dr. Hawthorne, are the reason you can sleep safely in your bed at night. And my name isn't Emma. It's Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane, United States Navy. And I've saved more lives before breakfast than you'll see in a year." The transformation was startling. Gone was the timid, apologetic nurse who jumped at shadows and apologized for existing. In her place stood a confident, competent medical professional who had performed surgery in combat zones and earned the respect of some of the toughest soldiers in the world. General Morrison nodded approvingly. "There's the Marine I remember." "I was Navy," Emma corrected automatically. "Attached to Marines. Close enough." Morrison gestured toward the door, where his team was already beginning to withdraw. "Time to go, Corpsman. We've got a bird waiting." Emma looked around the trauma bay one last time, her gaze settling on the supply cart she'd been restocking when this all began. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than an hour. She thought about the nights she'd spent hiding in the break room, the countless small humiliations she'd endured, the way she'd deliberately made herself invisible to avoid drawing attention. "Dr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice carrying the same authority it had when she'd talked Marcus down from his crisis. "That medication you wanted to give Torres? Haldol is contraindicated for combat trauma cases. It can trigger violent episodes and make the underlying condition worse. Maybe you should update your psychiatric protocols before you kill someone." Hawthorne's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Emma turned to Marcus, who was being helped to his feet by two of Morrison's men. They weren't treating him like a prisoner or a dangerous mental patient. They were treating him like a fellow soldier who needed help. "Torres," she said gently, "these are good people. They're going to take care of you." Marcus nodded, some of the confusion clearing from his eyes. "Will I see you again, Doc?" Emma smiled, the first genuine smile any of her colleagues had ever seen from her. "Marines and corpsmen stick together, Torres. Always." As they walked toward the exit, General Morrison fell into step beside her. "I have to ask," he said quietly. "Why did you choose to hide here? Of all the places you could have disappeared, Why a civilian hospital where nobody would appreciate what you're capable of? Emma considered the question as they moved through the corridors of Seattle Memorial, past the familiar sights and sounds that had been her world for the past 3 years. I guess I wanted to see if I could be normal, she said finally. If I could be the kind of person who saved lives without having to take them first. And how did that work out for you? Emma thought about Marcus Torres, about the way he'd trusted her voice in his darkest moment, about the satisfaction she'd felt when she'd talked him down from a situation that could have ended in tragedy. Better than I expected, she said. Maybe I didn't stop being a warrior after all. Maybe I just found a different way to fight. They reached the hospital's main entrance, where a Black Hawk helicopter waited on the street, its rotors turning lazily in the pre-dawn air. Seattle's streets were empty, except for emergency vehicles and the handful of military personnel securing the area. Emma paused at the threshold, looking back into the hospital one last time. Through the glass doors, she could see her former colleagues clustered in the lobby, talking animatedly among themselves. No doubt they were already turning the night's events into a story they could tell at parties. The night the quiet nurse turned out to be some kind of secret agent. Let them talk, she thought. They'd never understand the real story anyway. General Morrison was waiting for her beside the helicopter, holding out a familiar piece of equipment, her old corpsman bag, the one she'd carried through 3 deployments and more combat zones than she cared to remember. "We saved this for you," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the rotors. "Thought you might want it back." Emma took the bag, feeling the weight of memory and responsibility in her hands. Inside would be the instruments of her old trade. The syringes and bandages and medications that had kept Marines alive in the worst places on Earth. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself she was done with that life, that she could find meaning in the quiet work of civilian medicine. But as she looked at Marcus Torres, already strapped into the helicopter, and looking more at peace than he had all night, she realized that her war had never really ended. It had just changed battlefields. "Where are we going?" she asked Morrison as they climbed into the aircraft. "Walter Reed first, to get Torres stabilized and you reacclimated," Morrison replied. "Then we'll see about that situation in the Pacific." Emma nodded, settling into the familiar sensation of military transport. Around her, the tactical team was efficient and professional, their gear stowed and secured, their attention already focused on whatever mission lay ahead. These were her people, she realized. She'd spent 3 years trying to fit into a world where her skills were seen as excessive, her instincts as inappropriate, her very presence as somehow wrong. Here, among soldiers and Marines and the endless succession of broken warriors who needed healing, she belonged. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them into the pre-dawn darkness above Seattle. Below, the city spread out in a grid of lights, thousands of people sleeping safely in their beds, unaware of the small war that had just been fought and won in their local hospital. Emma Kane, also known as Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane, also known as Siren Four, pressed her face to the window and watched the lights fade into the distance. She was going back to war. But this time, she understood something she hadn't before. The war never really ended for people like her and Marcus Torres, and all the others who had seen too much and done too much in service to their country. The war just changed shape, found new places to hide, new ways to damage the people who were supposed to be home safe. And if that was true, then there would always be a need for people who understood both how to fight and how to heal, who could recognize a fellow warrior in distress and know exactly what to say to bring them back from the edge. Emma smiled and settled back in her seat, feeling more like herself than she had in 3 years. Dr. Hawthorne had been wrong about one thing. Some people were absolutely built for this work. The question was whether the work would build them up or tear them down in the process. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, she'd saved a fellow Marine from drowning in his own trauma. and that felt like a good start. The helicopter banked north, toward Walter Reed and whatever came after, carrying its cargo of wounded warriors toward whatever healing was possible in a world that broke people and then wondered why they couldn't just get over it. In the trauma bay at Seattle Memorial, Dr. Hawthorne stood among the scattered equipment and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The quiet nurse who couldn't handle criticism, who apologized for existing, had just talked down an armed Marine and then disappeared into the night with a military extraction team. "Did any of that really happen?" one of the residents asked. Hawthorne looked at the empty trauma bay, at the blood still on the floor and the scattered medical supplies, at the security footage that would no doubt be classified before morning. He thought about the way Emma's voice had changed, the way she'd stood straighter, the way she'd looked him in the eye for the first time in 18 months and told him he was wrong. "I don't think it matters," he said quietly. "I don't think we'll ever see her again." He was right about that. Emma Kane, the timid night nurse who jumped at loud noises and apologized for breathing, ceased to exist the moment those helicopter doors closed. In her place was Hospital Corpsman First Class Kane, a woman who had saved lives in the worst places on Earth and was ready to do it again. The mouse had always been a lion. She'd just been wearing a very convincing disguise.